The year is 1853. The Ottoman Empire, once a threat to all of Europe, is now in steady decline. Known once as the paramount peril to Christendom itself, now it was regarded as the sick man of Europe. The Sultan Abdul-Majid I, at center stage at mid-century, probably dreamt of the conquest of his ancestors, most glorious of all being the prize of Constantinople, captured in 1453. 4 centuries later, the great Sultan was paralyzed into a fate of idleness, for he had inherited a dying empire. He was to only look by as more powerful European powers looked to take advantage of him. Various players emerged from the Eastern question, including the Russian Empire, which for more than a century had made war with the Ottomans. The Ottomans were too weak to fend off Russia by themselves. Luckily for them, they didn't have to. France and Great Britain, for different reasons, were willing to help. Great Britain had financial and strategic interests, while the French Emperor Napoleon III looked to restore French glory and prestige. This introduced a great destabilizing factor into European politics, by which this point had upheld the status quo established at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. But now a new era of turbulence was fast approaching for Europe. A weak Ottoman Empire was subject to possible Russian aggression. This, the great powers of Europe feared, could disrupt the balance of power. As much as the Russians wanted to take advantage of the faltering Ottoman Empire, they did not want it to completely collapse. The Russians were content with keeping a weak but manageable dynasty. The British also had a vested interest in keeping the empire alive, even if it was sick from the inside. British financial interests were now tied to the survival of the Ottoman Empire, which would also lead to a mending of ties with the French. Both wanted to uphold the status quo. They did not want to see the balance of power in Europe be disturbed by Russian aggression. The Russians made a fatal mistake when they assumed they could persuade Britain and isolate France in the diplomatic dance that was being played out prior to the start of the war. The Tsar and his ministers had failed not only to understand British financial interest and their desire to seek Russian power halted, but also a hatred of sorts the British had for them. This mistake led them to believe they could make war with the Ottomans, as they had done countless times in the past without Anglo-French intervention. The competing ambitions of Napoleon III and the Russian Emperor Nicholas I were to be played out in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine, over the question of the rights of Christians living there. Catholic French and Orthodox Russians both asserted themselves as rightful sovereign authorities over the Christian population there. The Ottoman Sultan was too weak to assert himself and take a firm stand, leading to a gradual escalation, with the French sending in a warship to eventually the Russians in 1853 sending troops across the Danube. The Ottomans in response declared war. The Battle of Sinop saw Russia win a naval battle over the Ottomans in November. Shortly after, both Great Britain and France portrayed this battle as a massacre. This propaganda was used as a casus belli for war, even though there was no evidence of atrocities. Years of fighting would lead to exhaustion on both sides, and eventually the Russians would sue for peace after Prussia, Austria, and Sweden showed interest of joining the war against Russia. The Crimean War is regarded by some historians as a pointless and forgotten war, with the only real outcome being the death of hundreds of thousands on both sides. This is the opposite of the truth. The Crimean War was in fact a landmark event, for it inaugurated the antagonism between the West and Russia. You can trace a line between the beginning of this war to the present-day conflict with the West and Russia. For that reason alone, it deserves our attention. And if you look at it from a different perspective, you can see that there was a point to the war, a very British one. The British had a strange fixation on Russia. For them, Russia stood always as a threat that had to be first pushed back from further conquest and then crushed completely. They couldn't be trusted. The Russians further moving into the Balkans, the Caucasus, Central Asia were all potential problems for the British. This expansion prompted British hysteria, for they even feared that Russia could one day challenge British rule in India. But the problem is, the Russians didn't exactly think the way the British did. They did not have plans for a reconquest of Constantinople. They didn't even have a desire for a warm water port, a popular geopolitical myth propagated relentlessly by British statesmen. This myth was best put to rest by Pyotr Durnovo's memorandum to Tsar Nicholas II. Russia needs neither Korea nor even Port Arthur. An outlet to the sea is undoubtedly useful, but the sea itself is, after all, not a market, but merely a road to a more advantageous delivery of goods at the consuming markets. Durnovo would also go on to state, "We have no overseas colonies, and shall probably never have them, and communication between the various parts of our empire is easier over land than by water." Furthermore, Durnovo even goes on to state that the only reason that Russia would have an interest in occupying, say, the Turkish Straits would be to keep foreign intrusion out of the Black Sea. He states that as soon as Russian ships were to leave the Turkish Straits, they would be in territorial waters, and that a powerful British fleet would be ready to cut off any further movement. British concerns or paranoia over Russian expansion was the principal reason for the conflict. They saw every Russian foreign policy decision as an attempt to expand their influence at the expense of the British. The truth is that the British thought the Russians to be Englishmen, making decisions as such. The Russians, of course, were not. They had no overseas colonies, they did not need an outlet to the sea, and they were primarily a land empire. But for the British, Russia's advancements in the Balkans, Caucasus, and Central Asia were seen as a disturbance to the balance of power. However, we already know that Russia did not want to see the Ottoman Empire completely collapse. It instead actively helped it alongside other European powers to fend off rebellions, like the one in Egypt in the 1830s. Yet when the British expanded across the world, it wasn't seen as a disturbance to the balance of power. They were permitted to pursue their worldwide conquests. Although I'm in no way prescribing moral superiority to either side, especially in an age of empires, there does seem to be a double standard here. The Crimean War brought out the flames of Russian hatred. Despite the already extraordinary loss of life by 1855, the new British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was a hardliner who wanted to expand the war. Palmerston thought the much more powerful and free to maneuver Royal Navy could threaten St. Petersburg. Despite French and Austrian desire to make peace, he prolonged the war for the capture of Sevastopol to get more favorable peace terms. Whatever the British thought was gained from the Crimean War, the Russians gained much back in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. So in summary, it was all about power, who has it and who's threatening it. The Crimean War was one chapter in the British-Russian battle for hegemony. Events today also demonstrate that this is in no way finished, but that's for another video. It is now an Anglo-American alliance, which seeks to finish that goal of Palmerston's, crush Russia once and for all.